The hangar smelled of burnt oil and stale bourbon. It was past midnight, March 14, 1943, and a mechanic named Harold "Hank" Morrison was too drunk to realize he was about to change the history of tank warfare. They said he was a perfectionist, that he'd spent 15 years tightening bolts on engines that powered America's war machine. But that night, his hands weren't steady, and what should have been a catastrophic mistake turned into one of the strangest breakthroughs of World War II. Would you trust a drunk man to fix a $50 tank engine? Let me know in the comments, because this man's mistake ended up saving thousands of soldiers' lives. Now, let's go back to that cold Michigan night and see how a hangover built a better Sherman. The night of March 14, 1943, settled heavy over the Chrysler Defense Plant in Warren, Michigan, bringing with it that peculiar quality of industrial darkness that never achieves true blackness, but instead hovers in a perpetual gray twilight, illuminated by the harsh glare of overhead sodium lamps. The acrid smell of diesel oil mingled with steam escaping from overheated radiators, creating a ghostly fog that hung suspended in the cavernous space of testing hangar number 7. Under the unforgiving industrial lighting, Technical Sergeant Harold Morrison, known universally as Hank to the 300 men and women who worked the evening shift, moved with uncharacteristic uncertainty between the tools scattered across the grease-stained concrete floor. His movements traced an erratic pattern around an M4 Sherman that sat motionless in the center of the workspace, its tracks silent, its right R975 Cyclone radial engine dismantled into hundreds of metallic components that gleamed under the artificial illumination like the scattered pieces of some massive mechanical puzzle. Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the Chrysler assembly lines, who had been requisitioned for the war effort in January 1942, carried a reputation for meticulous precision that bordered on obsession. He was the mechanic supervisors called when a particularly troublesome engine refused to meet specifications, the man who could diagnose problems by sound alone, listening to an engine's rhythm the way a conductor hears the individual instruments in an orchestra. His personnel file, maintained in the administrative offices on the second floor of the main building, contained commendations from 3 different shift supervisors praising his attention to detail and his uncanny ability to identify problems that other mechanics missed. But Morrison also carried another reputation, one whispered rather than proclaimed, of occasionally seeking solace in a bottle of bourbon when the relentless pressure of wartime production quotas became unbearable. The strain of producing tanks for a two-front war, working 10-hour shifts 6 days per week, watching younger men ship out to use the machines he built while he remained stateside due to his age and essential worker status, all of it accumulated into a psychological weight that bourbon temporarily lightened. On this particular evening, witnesses would later testify that the veteran mechanic appeared visibly altered, stumbling over his own toolbox while attempting to reassemble a fuel delivery system that had malfunctioned during afternoon testing runs. What none of the night shift workers could predict was that those trembling hands, that confusion induced by exhaustion and alcohol, were about to accidentally modify one of the most widely produced war machines in history, and paradoxically improve it so significantly that sober engineers would spend the next 3 months attempting to reproduce exactly what Morrison had done wrong. The assembly line at Warren represented merely one small gear in the colossal industrial machine that had transformed America since December 1941 from isolationist democracy into the arsenal of democracy, a transformation so complete and overwhelming that it would fundamentally alter the global balance of power for the remainder of the century. The M4 Sherman medium tank had begun rolling off production lines in February 1942, and by war's end, more than 200 units would be manufactured across 11 different plants, operated by 5 major corporations, including Chrysler, General Motors, Ford, the Press Steel Car Company, and the Pacific Car and Foundry Company. This represented a production rate that left German engineers simultaneously impressed and terrified, recognizing that America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, produced approximately 6 Zu-30 Panther tanks and 1 350 Tiger tanks during the entire war, formidable machines individually superior to the Sherman in armor and firepower, but utterly overwhelmed by American industrial capacity. A single German Tiger tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce, while an American Sherman required only 10 man-hours, a 30-to-1 efficiency advantage that rendered German technical superiority strategically irrelevant. But quantity alone did not guarantee battlefield success, and American engineers understood this uncomfortable truth with crystalline clarity. The Wright R975 radial engine that powered the majority of Sherman variants had been adapted from aircraft designs, specifically from engines developed for training aircraft and light bombers during the 1930s. This expedient solution allowed rapid production by leveraging existing tooling and expertise from aviation manufacturing, avoiding the delays that would have accompanied developing an entirely new engine design. The engine delivered 400 horsepower that propelled the tank's 30-ton mass to a respectable maximum speed of 24 miles per hour on firm terrain, with a theoretical range of 120 miles on roads under ideal conditions. Though real-world range rarely exceeded 100 miles due to varied terrain, combat maneuvering, and the need to maintain tactical formations rather than optimal fuel economy. However, the cooling system proved notoriously temperamental, particularly in the scorching heat of North Africa, where tanks from the 1st Armored Division faced not only Rommel's Afrika Korps, but also ambient temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, when shade could be found. The Saharan environment proved brutally unforgiving to mechanical systems designed in temperate Michigan. Sand infiltrated air filters despite multiple protective measures, forcing more frequent maintenance. The reflective heat from sand and rock surfaces created thermal environments where external temperatures exceeded 140 degrees, turning the interior of tanks into furnaces that tested both machinery and human endurance. Field reports from January 1943 indicated that approximately 18% of Sherman losses in the North African theater were attributed not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failures related to overheating. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the brutal baptism of American armor against veteran German forces, of the 183 American tanks committed to action, 42 were lost to mechanical problems before ever engaging the enemy. A humiliating ratio that suggested American armor might be defeated by its own inadequacies before German guns even came into play. This represented a silent scandal that threatened to undermine confidence in American armored capabilities and raised uncomfortable questions about whether industrial might could compensate for technical inadequacy. Morrison was not contemplating strategic implications or production statistics as he struggled with the fuel delivery system on that cold March night. The bourbon had dulled his reflexes, but curiously also relaxed the perfectionist tension that normally compelled him to follow every specification in the technical manual with monastic precision. The manual itself, a thick binder containing detailed assembly instructions for the Wright R975, sat open on a nearby workbench, its pages covered with grease fingerprints and marginal notes from dozens of mechanics who had consulted it over months of production. Morrison had assembled so many of these engines that he rarely needed to consult the manual anymore, working instead from muscle memory that functioned almost independently of conscious thought. His hands, operating more through that accumulated experience than deliberate planning, began reconnecting fuel lines, but reversed the sequence of 2 pressure regulators in the process. The error was subtle, the kind of mistake that a sober Morrison would have caught immediately, but in his impaired state the reversed configuration appeared correct to his alcohol-blurred vision. The regulators themselves were brass cylinders approximately 3 inches long, stamped with directional arrows indicating proper flow direction, but Morrison's unfocused eyes failed to register the reversed orientation. Compounding this initial error, as Morrison attempted to compensate for what his dulled senses dimly registered as something not quite right, he displaced the fuel injection point several centimeters rearward in the combustion chamber, subtly altering the ignition timing. The modification was measured in millimeters, barely visible to casual inspection, but it fundamentally changed when fuel entered the cylinder relative to piston position. In a properly functioning radial engine, timing represents one of the most critical parameters. Fuel must enter the combustion chamber at precisely the correct moment in the piston stroke to maximize energy extraction while minimizing waste heat and preventing detonation that could destroy engine components. Standard Wright R975 specifications called for fuel injection to begin when the piston reached a position 18 degrees before top dead center, a timing calculated through extensive testing to provide optimal performance with available fuel grades and expected operating conditions. Morrison's accidental displacement shifted this timing to approximately 32 degrees before top dead center, a variation that should theoretically have reduced performance or possibly caused engine damage through pre-ignition. When Morrison finally tightened the last bolt at 3 o'clock in the morning, the mechanic could barely keep his eyes open. Exhaustion and alcohol combined to create a state where consciousness narrowed to a tunnel focused solely on completing the immediate task, with no capacity remaining for reflection or quality checking. He registered the assembly's completion on the quality control clipboard with an illegible signature and staggered home to his modest apartment on Mound Road, leaving the modified Sherman scheduled for routine testing the following morning. What Morrison could not know, could not possibly comprehend in his compromised state, was that this apparently disastrous combination of errors had created a fuel flow pattern and ignition timing that increased the engine's thermal efficiency by approximately 11%, significantly reducing the waste heat that caused the Sherman's infamous overheating problems. The reversed pressure regulators created a more turbulent fuel flow that promoted superior atomization, breaking fuel into finer droplets that burned more completely. The altered injection timing synchronized combustion more efficiently with the piston cycle, extracting more energy from each fuel droplet before heat could be wasted through the exhaust system. It was, by any engineering standard, an impossible accident, the mechanical equivalent of randomly striking piano keys and accidentally composing Mozart. The discovery unfolded with almost comedic inevitability. On the morning of March 15th, Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford, chief engineer of the Chrysler testing program, personally supervised a battery of stress tests on 6 newly assembled Shermans. Bradford, a West Point graduate who had spent a decade at General Motors before being commissioned into the Ordnance Department in 1940, approached testing with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that soldiers' lives depended on the reliability of machines his teams produced. His background combined practical engineering experience with military discipline, making him ideally suited for the pressures of wartime production where speed and quality existed in constant tension. The testing protocols were brutally simple by design, engines running at maximum power for 3 consecutive hours, while instruments recorded oil temperature, cooling system pressure, cylinder temperature, fuel consumption, and dozens of other parameters. The tests simulated sustained combat operations, where tanks might need to run continuously at high power for extended periods, during breakthrough operations, sustained advances, or fighting retreats where stopping for engine cooling could prove fatal. 5 of the tanks behaved exactly as expected, oil temperature gradually climbing to stabilize at 230 degrees Fahrenheit, cylinder temperatures oscillating dangerously close to the maximum threshold of 450 degrees, cooling systems working at full capacity to prevent catastrophic failure. Test engineers monitored the instruments with practiced eyes, watching for the warning signs that indicated an engine approaching thermal limits. Cooling system pressure typically peaked around 18 psi during these tests, with occasional spikes to 20 psi that caused anxious moments until pressure stabilized. But the 6th tank, the one assembled by Morrison, displayed readings that Bradford initially dismissed as instrumentation malfunction. Oil temperature stable at 203 degrees, cylinders never exceeding 410 degrees. Cooling system pressure holding steady at 14 psi with no significant spikes. Fuel consumption, measured meticulously by weighing tanks before and after testing, was 8% lower than average, a difference that translated to roughly 10 additional miles of range under combat conditions. Bradford ordered the test repeated, convinced that faulty sensors were providing false data. Perhaps a thermocouple had failed, or a pressure gauge had stuck, or the fuel measurement system had been calibrated incorrectly. 3 days and 12 test batteries later, with fresh instrumentation installed and triple-checked, the truth became inescapable. Something in that specific engine made it substantially superior to its siblings. The performance advantage remained consistent across all test conditions: maximum power, sustained cruising, rapid throttle transitions. The mystery engine outperformed its siblings in every measurable parameter. The hunt to discover what had happened began in earnest, and Bradford assembled a team of 14 engineers to solve the mystery. The investigation proceeded with the careful deliberation of forensic scientists examining crucial evidence. Over the following weeks, Bradford's team dismantled Morrison's engine with surgical delicacy, treating each component as a potential clue to understanding the performance anomaly. Every part was photographed from multiple angles, using a specialized technical camera that produced large-format negatives suitable for detailed examination. Measurements were taken with calipers accurate to thousandths of an inch and micrometers capable of even finer resolution, then compared against original specifications maintained in thick binders of technical drawings that occupied an entire wall of Bradford's office. The process was tedious and time-consuming, requiring 2 full weeks before the team identified the modifications that would eventually be designated in technical reports as the Morrison modifications, a name assigned before anyone realized the unintentional irony. The reversed pressure regulators were discovered first, on March 29th, when engineer Thomas Wickham noticed that the flow direction arrows stamped on the regulator housings pointed opposite to their installed orientation. Wickham, a recent MIT graduate with a specialty in fluid dynamics, immediately recognized the implications. Reversed flow through a pressure regulator should create excessive turbulence and potentially dangerous pressure fluctuations. The discovery prompted immediate concern that the engine should have failed catastrophically, that reversed regulators should have created excessive pressure leading to ruptured fuel lines or worse. Yet the test data clearly demonstrated superior performance, creating a paradox that demanded explanation. Wickham spent 3 days constructing a test rig that allowed examination of fuel flow patterns through reversed regulators, using a transparent acrylic section that permitted visual observation of flow characteristics. What he discovered challenged conventional understanding of fuel delivery systems. The reversed regulators created a turbulent flow pattern that broke fuel into much finer droplets than the standard laminar flow, an effect that modern engineers would recognize as beneficial for combustion, but that 1943 theory suggested should be problematic. The altered injection timing was harder to identify, requiring precision measurements comparing Morrison's engine to factory specifications maintained with obsessive accuracy by Chrysler's Quality Control Division. When finally documented on April 6th, the displaced injection point measured precisely 47 millimeters rearward from specification, a seemingly trivial variation that should have been inconsequential. Standard engineering practice held that injection timing variations of less than 100 millimeters produced negligible performance changes, yet this supposedly inconsequential modification correlated with dramatic improvements. When Bradford's team constructed computational models, crude by later standards but sophisticated for 1943, involving teams of women operating mechanical calculators for days to produce results that modern computers could generate in milliseconds, the synergistic interaction between reversed regulators and altered timing became apparent. The turbulent fuel flow created by reversed regulators atomized fuel into droplets averaging 15 microns in diameter compared to the standard 28 microns, providing vastly increased surface area for combustion. Smaller droplets burned more completely and rapidly, extracting more chemical energy before exhaust valves opened. The altered timing ensured these atomized droplets entered the cylinder at the optimal moment in the piston stroke, maximizing energy extraction while minimizing waste heat. It was, in Bradford's words from his report dated April 8, 1943, an optimization that no sober engineer would have attempted because it violated 3 accepted principles of radial engine design, and which inexplicably worked better than anything we had tried deliberately. Reproducing Morrison's error proved surprisingly complex, revealing the narrow margins within which the modifications functioned optimally. Engineers spent the entire month of April attempting to document the precise changes and translate them into specifications that assembly line mechanics could follow consistently. The challenge lay in the interdependence of the modifications. Altering only the regulators or only the timing produced minimal improvement, or, in some troubling cases, actually worsened performance. Both modifications needed to be implemented within tolerances measured in millimeters, requiring precision that standard assembly line procedures could not guarantee. The first attempt at large-scale implementation in May 1943 resulted in only 23% of modified engines achieving Morrison-level performance improvements. Another 15% showed modest gains, while the remaining 62% demonstrated either no significant change or increased problems including rough running, excessive vibration, and in 3 cases, actual decreases in fuel efficiency compared to standard engines. Bradford's team spent 3 weeks analyzing the failures, eventually determining that machining tolerances for the injection point displacement needed to be held within plus or minus 2 millimeters, far tighter than standard production practices, which typically allowed variations of up to 5 millimeters. The reversed regulators proved easier to implement since they required only installation in opposite orientation. But even here, consistency proved elusive. Some regulators, despite being theoretically identical parts produced from the same tooling, performed differently when reversed due to minor manufacturing variations that became significant when operating outside design parameters. Internal surface finish variations of less than 1 micron, completely irrelevant in standard orientation, created measurable performance differences when reversed. It required until June for Chrysler to develop precision jigs and sufficiently rigorous quality control procedures to ensure consistency. The new procedures added 17 inspection points to the assembly process, each requiring specialist training and adding approximately 90 minutes to total engine assembly time. By July 1943, production of Shermans with Morrison engines, officially redesignated as Wright R975C4 to distinguish them from standard R975 variants, finally achieved reliable output, with 89% of units meeting improved specifications. The implementation timeline created an interesting natural experiment in battlefield effectiveness. Tanks equipped with standard engines and Morrison-modified engines served simultaneously in the same theaters, providing direct performance comparisons under identical conditions. Modified Shermans began arriving in North Africa in August 1943, just as operations shifted to Sicily and then mainland Italy. The Italian campaign provided particularly demanding conditions for testing mechanical reliability. The mountainous terrain required sustained operation at high power settings as tanks climbed steep grades, while summer temperatures in the Po Valley rivaled North African heat. Field reports from the 2nd Armored Division conducting operations in the brutal Italian summer documented a 64% reduction in mechanical failures related to overheating among tanks equipped with C4 engines compared to standard variants. The improvement manifested particularly during sustained operations when tanks ran continuously for 8 to 12 hours, conditions that routinely pushed standard Shermans to thermal limits. During the advance toward Naples in September 1943, the 2nd Armored reported that of 38 standard Shermans in the division, 11 required engine repairs or replacement due to heat-related damage over a 2-week period, while only 2 of the 41 C4-equipped tanks experienced similar problems. The statistical difference was dramatic enough that division commanders began specifically requesting C4-equipped tanks, creating allocation disputes that required intervention from Theater Logistics Command. Some units attempted to trade or swap vehicles to concentrate C4 engines in line companies, while relegating standard Shermans to headquarters and support roles. The improved reliability translated directly into tactical advantages. Tank platoons with C4 engines could maintain contact with retreating German forces for longer periods without mandatory cooling stops, closing the gap that often allowed skilled German commanders to establish new defensive positions. In mobile warfare, the ability to sustain operations for an additional 2 or 3 hours before requiring maintenance could mean the difference between cutting off an enemy retreat and allowing forces to escape. The fuel efficiency improvement, while secondary to reliability gains, provided an average range extension of approximately 10 miles, seemingly modest but tactically significant given the logistical challenges of keeping advancing armored divisions supplied with fuel. In a typical armored division advance, fuel trucks needed to make 1 fewer resupply run per week when serving C4-equipped units, freeing transport capacity for ammunition and other supplies. The Morrison modifications proved equally valuable in the European theater following the Normandy invasion in June 1944, though for different reasons than in the Mediterranean. The bocage country of northern France, with its dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, required tanks to frequently operate at high throttle settings during short, violent engagements, creating rapid thermal cycling that stressed cooling systems differently than sustained operations. Tanks would idle in assembly areas for hours, then surge to maximum power during brief assaults, then return to idle, a pattern that created thermal shock as components rapidly heated and cooled. C4 engines demonstrated superior tolerance for these thermal shocks, maintaining stable operating temperatures through rapid transitions between idle and maximum power that caused standard engines to overheat. The improved thermal management prevented the thermal stress that led to head gasket failures, cracked cylinder heads, and warped components that plagued standard engines operating under these conditions. During Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the breakout from Normandy that transformed the campaign from attritional stalemate to war of maneuver, units equipped predominantly with C4 Shermans reported 28% fewer mechanical casualties than comparable units with standard engines. This translated to more tanks available for the rapid exploitation that characterized the breakout, contributing to the operational success that trapped German forces in the Falaise pocket. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 provided perhaps the most unexpected validation of Morrison's accidental innovation. The brutal winter conditions, with temperatures plunging well below 0 Fahrenheit and reaching as low as -20 in some areas, created inverse problems where engines struggled to reach and maintain optimal operating temperatures. Standard Sherman engines, designed for temperate conditions, often required 20 to 30 minutes of warming before achieving operating temperature in sub-zero conditions, during which tanks remained vulnerable and immobile. The improved thermal efficiency of C4 engines meant they generated sufficient heat even in extreme cold, while wasting less fuel. A critical advantage when supply lines were stretched thin and every gallon of gasoline counted. Tank crews reported that C4 Shermans reached operating temperature approximately 40% faster than standard variants in sub-zero conditions, reducing the vulnerable period when tanks were immobilized during engine warm-up from 30 minutes to approximately 18 minutes. This seemingly modest improvement proved tactically significant during the German offensive when American forces were caught dispersed and needed to concentrate rapidly. Units equipped with C4 engines could respond to changing situations more quickly, reaching defensive positions or counterattacking before German forces consolidated gains. Post-war analysis conducted by the Army's Ordnance Department estimated that Morrison modifications saved approximately 2,800 tanks that would otherwise have been lost to mechanical failures across all theaters, the equivalent of nearly 6 full armored divisions or approximately 20. Source crewmen who returned home because their engines did not abandon them in hostile territory. The human element of this story proved as complex and unpredictable as the technical dimensions. Harold Morrison's reaction to discovering his accidental innovation, mixed embarrassment, disbelief, and a stubborn refusal to accept recognition that bordered on pathological modesty. When Bradford finally confronted Morrison in mid-April 1943, the engineer approached the conversation with diplomatic care, aware that he was potentially accusing a valued employee of working while intoxicated, but also attempting to credit that same employee with a breakthrough. The meeting took place in Bradford's office, a cramped space dominated by filing cabinets and technical drawings, with Morrison standing uncomfortably while Bradford sat behind his cluttered desk. Morrison initially denied any deviation from standard procedures, insisting with visible agitation that he always followed technical manuals precisely, that the suggestion he had done otherwise implied incompetence or negligence. His face flushed, hands clenching and unclenching, betraying the anxiety of a craftsman whose professional identity depended on precision being confronted with evidence of error. Only when Bradford showed photographs of the modifications and explained their revolutionary implications did Morrison, pale and visibly shaken, admit that he might have been somewhat tired that particular night and possibly not following the manual with complete attention. The careful euphemisms did not fool Bradford, who had noticed the faint smell of bourbon that occasionally emanated from Morrison's workstation on late shifts, but the engineer chose discretion over confrontation. Bradford understood that Morrison's expertise remained valuable despite occasional lapses, that the wartime production demands pushed everyone beyond normal limits, that strict enforcement of sobriety rules would decimate the workforce when experienced mechanics were desperately scarce. The legend of the drunk mechanic was born in the corridors and break rooms of the Chrysler Defense Plant, whispered with a mixture of admiration and incredulity, embellished with each retelling until the story bore only passing resemblance to the prosaic reality of an exhausted craftsman who had a few drinks too many and made fortuitous mistakes. The company never officially confirmed the more colorful details, maintaining in official statements only that an experienced mechanic had discovered an innovative engine configuration during routine assembly operations. Morrison, to his considerable credit, never sought nor accepted public recognition for the modifications that bore his name in internal documents. He declined a proposed promotion that would have moved him from the assembly floor to a supervisory position with a 20% salary increase, explaining simply that he was a mechanic, not a manager, and that pushing paper in an office would drive him mad within a week. When Bradford attempted to arrange a military commendation through Army Ordnance Department channels, recognizing that Morrison's contribution had saved American lives, Morrison refused to cooperate with the paperwork, effectively killing the nomination. He would not fill out the required forms, would not sit for interviews with Army personnel, would not provide the personal history information needed for official citations. He continued working the same assembly line shift through the remainder of the war, maintaining his reputation for meticulous work while apparently managing his relationship with bourbon sufficiently to avoid another productive accident, or at least none that were discovered and documented. The broader implications of the Morrison modifications extended beyond immediate battlefield applications, influencing post-war engine design in ways that would not become fully apparent for decades. The turbulent fuel atomization created by reversed pressure regulators anticipated developments in fuel injection technology that would not be formalized academically until the 1950s and would not see widespread commercial application until diesel engines became common in passenger vehicles during the 1970s. Engineers at Chrysler, recognizing that they had stumbled onto something significant but not fully understanding the underlying principles, initiated a research program in 1944 to investigate fuel atomization systematically. This program continued after the war with support from the newly created Office of Naval Research, contributed to the theoretical foundation for modern direct fuel injection systems that would eventually replace carburetors in automotive applications. The altered ignition timing, while specific to the Wright R975 radial configuration, demonstrated principles of optimizing combustion phasing that would become central to engine efficiency improvements across all internal combustion designs. Graduate engineering programs at MIT and Caltech incorporated case studies of the Morrison modifications into coursework during the 1950s, using them to illustrate how empirical discovery sometimes precedes theoretical understanding, and how innovations can emerge from unexpected sources. The case became a favorite of professors teaching engineering design methodology, embodying lessons about the limits of theoretical knowledge and the value of careful observation of anomalous results. Students learned that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from planned experiments, but from investigating why something worked differently than expected. That attention to anomalies often proved more valuable than confirmation of predictions. The production history of Morrison-modified engines reflected the massive scale of American industrial mobilization. From July 1943 through May 1945, approximately 400 Wright R975 C4 engines were manufactured at the Chrysler Warren plant and at a secondary production facility established in Evansville, Indiana, specifically to meet demand for the improved engines. These engines equipped not only M4 Sherman tanks, but were also adapted for M32 tank recovery vehicles and M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, spreading the reliability improvements across multiple armored vehicle types. The M32 recovery vehicles particularly benefited from improved reliability since they operated under severe stress towing disabled tanks, often while under fire, making mechanical failures especially dangerous. The manufacturing process for C4 engines required 17 additional quality control checkpoints compared to standard R975 production, adding approximately 90 minutes to total assembly time per engine, but reducing the reject rate from 8% to less than 2%. The improved quality control procedures developed for C4 production were gradually applied to all engine manufacturing at Chrysler, contributing to overall improvements in production efficiency that persisted into post-war automotive manufacturing. The techniques for maintaining tight tolerances on high-volume production lines developed for C4 engines influenced Chrysler's post-war civilian vehicle production, contributing to the company's reputation for reliable engines during the 1950s. The economic impact proved substantial. The Army Ordnance Department calculated that reduced field maintenance requirements for C-4-equipped vehicles saved approximately $23 million in replacement parts and maintenance labor during 1944 alone, with comparable savings in 1945. Staggering sums representing hundreds of millions in current dollars. The fuel efficiency improvements, aggregated across thousands of vehicles operating over millions of miles, reduced total fuel consumption by an estimated 47 million gallons over the course of the war, enough to fill a supertanker and representing significant savings in both petroleum products and the shipping capacity required to transport fuel to combat theaters. Given that transporting each gallon of fuel to forward areas required shipping capacity, port facilities, trucks, and personnel, the fuel savings cascaded through the entire logistics system, freeing resources for other purposes. Morrison himself retired from Chrysler in 1946, accepting a modest pension calculated based on his years of service and final salary grade, moving to a small cottage in Traverse City, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Michigan, where property remained affordable for working-class retirees. He worked occasionally as a marine engine mechanic during summers, servicing fishing boats and pleasure craft for wealthy summer residents who appreciated his expertise and attention to detail, but spent increasing amounts of time woodworking and building furniture with the same meticulous attention that had characterized his wartime work. His furniture, constructed from locally sourced cherry and maple, earned him a small reputation among Traverse City residents as a craftsman who could be trusted to deliver quality work on schedule. Former colleagues who visited him during retirement years reported that Morrison kept no mementos from his time at the defense plant, maintained no scrapbook of newspaper clippings about the Sherman tank, displayed no interest in attending reunions or commemorative events organized by Chrysler for wartime employees. His cottage contained no evidence that he had contributed to the war effort beyond a single black and white photograph, tucked in a drawer, showing him standing with his assembly team in front of a completed Sherman, all of them squinting against bright sunlight, looking tired but satisfied. When a reporter from the Detroit Free Press tracked him down in 1963, preparing a 20th anniversary feature on wartime industrial production, Morrison declined to be interviewed, offering only the terse comment that he had simply done his job like thousands of other workers and deserved no special attention. The reporter noted in his notes that Morrison seemed uncomfortable with the entire conversation, anxious to end the interview and return to the rocking chair he was building in his workshop. He died quietly in 1971, at age 68, of heart failure, leaving behind a wife, 2 adult children, and 5 grandchildren who knew him as a quiet man who built beautiful furniture and occasionally drank too much at family gatherings, but who never spoke about the war. His obituary in the Traverse City Record-Eagle ran 4 paragraphs and made no mention of the Morrison modifications, identifying him simply as a retired Chrysler machinist and devoted family man. Only decades later, when historians researching Sherman tank development interviewed surviving Chrysler engineers in the 1980s and 1990s, did Morrison's accidental contribution to military technology become documented in published historical accounts. The legend that grew around Morrison exemplified a particularly American form of mythology, the accidental genius, the common worker who stumbles into innovation through circumstances rather than deliberate invention, validating democratic ideals about capability existing throughout society rather than being concentrated in educated elites. This narrative fit comfortably within American cultural traditions, celebrating ordinary people achieving extraordinary results, from Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter, becoming president, to Thomas Edison, the self-taught inventor revolutionizing technology. Engineers at Chrysler used the Morrison story in training programs through the 1950s and 1960s, citing it as an example of how breakthroughs could emerge from unexpected sources and emphasizing the importance of investigating anomalous results rather than dismissing them as measurement errors or statistical flukes. The story appeared in engineering textbooks, corporate training manuals, and motivational presentations, gradually acquiring embellishments that Morrison himself would probably have found mortifying. Some versions claimed he was completely drunk rather than merely impaired. Others suggested he had been celebrating his birthday or drowning sorrows over a failed romance. Still others introduced financial troubles or family problems as context for the drinking. The truth, as documented in contemporary Chrysler records and Bradford's detailed technical reports preserved in company archives, was simultaneously more mundane and more interesting. A skilled craftsman whose judgment was impaired by exhaustion and alcohol, but whose accumulated expertise and muscle memory remained functional enough to accidentally produce an innovative configuration while making what should have been disastrous errors. The incident illustrated the complex relationship between skill, intuition, and conscious deliberation in technical work, suggesting that sometimes creativity emerged from the suspension of the critical faculty that normally constrained exploration to known safe parameters. Morrison's years of experience had built neural pathways and muscle memory that functioned semi-independently of conscious thought, allowing his hands to work even when his conscious mind was impaired, occasionally producing combinations that deliberate planning would have rejected as violating established principles. The broader context of American tank development provided important perspective on the significance of Morrison's contribution. The Sherman was never intended to be a match for German heavy armor in one-on-one engagements. American tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where tanks supported infantry and vice versa, relying on numerical superiority, air support, and artillery, rather than individual technical superiority. The Sherman's 75mm main gun could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of German Tiger or Panther tanks at standard combat ranges, a deficiency that caused considerable anxiety among American commanders and led to desperate field expedients including mounting additional armor plates and using more powerful 76mm guns in later variants. But American doctrine never envisioned tank-on-tank duels as the primary mission. Shermans were intended to exploit breakthroughs created by artillery and air power, to support infantry advances, to serve as mobile fire support platforms. The Morrison modifications did not transform the Sherman into a Tiger killer. Its main gun remained inadequate against frontal armor of German heavy tanks, regardless of engine improvements. But reliability represented a force multiplier that amplified American numerical advantages in ways that improved firepower never could. A tank that could maintain operational status through sustained operations, that required less frequent maintenance, that consumed less fuel, effectively multiplied American combat power by ensuring maximum availability. The distinction between mechanical and combat losses proved crucial. A tank destroyed by enemy fire was definitively lost, requiring complete replacement, but a tank disabled by mechanical failure might be recovered and repaired if the battlefield situation allowed, returning to service days or weeks later. The improved reliability of C4-equipped Shermans meant more tanks available for combat at any given time, effectively increasing American armored strength without building additional vehicles. This aligned perfectly with American strategic advantages, leveraging industrial capacity and logistical capability to overwhelm technically superior but numerically inferior German forces. Morrison's modifications, while seemingly minor compared to fundamental design changes like improved armor or more powerful guns, contributed meaningfully to this strategic approach by incrementally improving reliability across thousands of vehicles. The post-war fate of surviving Morrison-modified Shermans illustrated the long operational life of successful military equipment. Many C4-equipped tanks remained in American inventory through the 1950s, serving in National Guard units and training facilities where their improved reliability reduced maintenance burden for part-time soldiers who lacked the support infrastructure of active duty units. Foreign military sales programs transferred hundreds of Shermans to Allied nations during the 1950s and 1960s, and C4 variants proved particularly popular because their reliability reduced maintenance burden for nations with less developed logistics infrastructure. Israeli Defense Forces operated Morrison-modified Shermans with considerable success during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and even during the Six-Day War in 1967, by which time the tanks were more than 20 years old, but remained functional due to robust design and the reliability improvements that kept them operational. Israeli mechanics, working with limited resources and spare parts, particularly appreciated the reduced maintenance requirements of C4 engines. Some estimates suggest that the last combat operational Sherman with a C4 engine was finally retired from service by the Chilean Army in the mid-1980s, giving the design a remarkable 40-year service life, a longevity almost unheard of for armored fighting vehicles. Several Morrison-modified engines survive in museums, including examples at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Tank Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, preserved as examples of wartime industrial innovation. None bear plaques mentioning Harold Morrison or explaining the unusual origin of their design features, remaining anonymous exemplars of a broader technological narrative about American industrial might and engineering improvisation. The Morrison incident ultimately represented more than a quirky historical anecdote about drunk innovation or a feel-good story about the contributions of ordinary workers. It embodied fundamental truths about how technological progress actually occurs, often through messy combinations of accident, expertise, systematic investigation, and institutional follow-through, rather than through the clean narratives of deliberate invention that populate textbooks and popular histories. Morrison possessed the accumulated knowledge necessary to make productive errors. A less experienced worker attempting the same assembly while intoxicated would have simply produced a non-functional engine requiring complete disassembly and reconstruction. The expertise embedded in his muscle memory, built through thousands of hours of repetitive practice, provided the foundation that allowed accident to produce innovation rather than disaster. Bradford and the Chrysler engineering team possessed the systematic methodology necessary to identify and document the modifications, transforming a one-time accident into a reproducible process that could be implemented across thousands of engines. Without that institutional capacity for investigation and analysis, Morrison's fortuitous errors would have remained an isolated anomaly, perhaps noticed, but never understood or reproduced. The institutional commitment to quality control and continuous improvement provided the framework within which an accidental discovery could be investigated, rather than dismissed as anomalous data to be ignored in favor of confirming existing theories. The military logistics system provided feedback mechanisms that identified field performance improvements and created demand for broader implementation, ensuring that laboratory discoveries translated into operational capabilities. Each element was necessary but insufficient by itself. The full story required all components working in sequence, from initial accident through systematic investigation to large-scale production and field validation, and finally to feedback loops that confirmed value and justified continued investment. This multi-stage process of innovation, moving from serendipitous discovery through deliberate development to operational deployment, exemplified how military technology development actually functioned during World War II. Driven by the urgent pressure of wartime necessity that compressed timelines and forced rapid iteration. The Morrison modifications succeeded not despite institutional processes, but because those processes, while imperfect, were robust enough to recognize and amplify an unexpected improvement rather than suppressing deviation from established specifications. In organizations where conformity to specifications was valued above results, Morrison's modifications would have been identified as errors, the engines rejected, the mechanic perhaps disciplined, and the performance improvements never discovered. The fact that Chrysler's processes included thorough performance testing before final acceptance, that Bradford's team investigated anomalous results rather than dismissing them, that the organization could rapidly modify production procedures to incorporate improvements. All of this proved as important as Morrison's initial accident. In this sense, Morrison's contribution proved less significant as individual innovation than as validation of organizational systems capable of leveraging innovation regardless of source, treating all performance improvements as valuable, whether emerging from deliberate engineering or from a tired mechanic's impaired judgment on a cold March night in Michigan, when the difference between right and wrong became blurred enough that accident could masquerade as intention and produce results that intention alone might never have achieved.